And so there's an anecdote to these things that we're talking about. And what's cool, whether we're looking at the ghost of Christmas past or we're looking ahead at that grim reaper and the sickle, which is the ghost of Christmas yet to come, the antidote to this feeling of loathing ourselves is... There's one thing that's happening in pop psychology, I think even circles of religion, that I don't actually agree with. And the concept is only positivity all the time. The truth is that every single person that graduates from childhood has experiences that they don't like. Those experiences that they don't like are an accumulation of thoughts that feel like things that they loathe, things that they wish were different. There's a term for that, and it's a term that we don't need to be scared of. There's a term that we don't need to discount. We just need to call it is what it is, and that is hatred. Ooh, it's a yucky word, isn't it? But that word of feeling from time to time a little hate towards ourselves is real. The good news is that it's totally normal. You're not the only one that feels that way. In fact, I think it would be the most insane thing in the world to say that you always felt good about yourself, right? So you can hold yourself in high regard, and you can still at times not like yourself. You can love Jesus and still at times not like the things that you've experienced. You can have them both, and I think being a human being is a complicated, almost contradictory experience at times. Now, emotions in general are just signals that something has happened that we would like to repeat, or something has happened that we would like to never experience again. Hatred, disgust, loathing is simply just one of these emotions. Feeling this at times is no more morally worse or better than feeling other emotions. It's just a signal of something. What I see happening, though, is this compensation. I see this tendency for us to think that if I can only focus on the positivity, that this doesn't exist. Now, on the other extreme, we can be totally absorbed in these things, so much so that we're paralyzed to do anything with our lives. I believe those are extremes, and the virtuous path for all of us is to find somewhere in the middle where we're not avoiding, but we're not letting it envelop us completely. In other words, what we're here to talk about is how to successfully deal with this feeling that we all feel. I can sum this up in one sentence, and the sentence is this: self-loathing is an outsized sense of something that's happened to you or something that is going to happen. Street version of that is you took one thing and you said, because this happened one time, this is going to happen every time, always. Now, if we use something that didn't have to do with your own self-narrative or psychology, it would be absolutely ridiculous. If you grabbed a rotten banana at the grocery store, you would not say, because I grabbed this rotten banana, all bananas are rotten from now and forever. But we do that sometimes with the things that are in our head or the experiences that we felt. Man, this person said this thing about me one time, and so it must be true in everything that's going to happen to me forever. If you're a parent, you know how to handle this with your kids. You'll hear this language that, for lack of a better term, sounds really dramatic. Man, Jennifer is always picking on me. And you'll say, always? Every single time it's happened like this? And they will say, okay, well, not always. And that's really the first step of what you got to do with yourself. Now, before we get into the actual things that you can do to air it out, as we'll call, I always think it's interesting to figure out, man, why do we do this in the first place? How do we arrive at this point as adults? And this probably isn't a newsflash to you, but our brain is incredibly sophisticated, but it's not always accurate. There's parts of executive functioning that work really well at creating shortcuts, at making sure that when I go to a door, I don't have to figure out how a door works every time. But a lot of these assumptions and these shortcuts create some distress for us for things that haven't yet happened. There's a part of our brain called the verbal working memory system that does this wildly sophisticated thing of taking raw data points that we see, hear, and experience, and they create a story. They literally are creating some summary of what's happened to you that you can refer back to. There's an acronym on the internet. It's called TLDR, which stands for too long, didn't read. And I think when we recall these situations that we've been in, a lot of times it's TLDR. We're giving a summary of what were the big emotional, salient data points that happen here, but it's not really the full accurate story. And so if we know that happens to us, then we can be aware that we have a tendency to do that. That some of the things that flash up in our brains, some of the language that we use inside of our head may not always be accurate. And if that's true, and it is, then we know that we have the opportunity to potentially rewrite that script, potentially bring in a different director to this movie that we're watching in the slideshow of our brain, and make sure that it's not causing us to downward spiral into something that isn't serving us very well. Now, there's something else that happens, and again, it's a fallacy of our brains, is that we have bias, we have inaccuracy when it comes to estimating what is going to happen. Different than what's already happened and us making some assumptions. But as we look forward, a lot of times we have some inaccuracy as far as how long something will take, how much work goes into it. And a lot of times the expectations that we set are so unrealistic in so many different ways that we're constantly disappointed, not because of the pressure that somebody else has put on us, but the pressure that we put on ourselves. And so there's an anecdote to these things that we're talking about. And what's cool, whether we're looking at the ghost of Christmas past, or we're looking ahead at that, Grim Reaper and the sickle, which is the ghost of Christmas yet to come, the antidote to this feeling of loathing ourselves is humility. That's a weird word, and I bet you didn't think I was going to say it. It's also not a word that we hear very often on social media. But humility is not blowing out of proportion something that's already happened to you. Humility is not over-exaggerating what you'll need in the future to feel accomplished. So my actions for you, the strategies, whether you're looking back or you're looking forward, is to air it out. Now, one little asterisk and one little sidebar. I'm not saying that anything that's happened to you in the past that was traumatic or really hard was not that. I am not changing the facts of stories that have happened to you. Each one of us, when we arrive in adulthood, have had things by our own estimation that are really hard. We're not taking anything away from that. But in order to air out something that has happened to you in the past, you need two things. You need something to write this down with, and you need a pen to write it down on. Airing this out is a process that I think works really well by yourself in solitude, because a lot of these things that we're going to unpack are heavy. A lot of these things that we're going to unpack, we don't need to tell our 6-year-olds about it. We need to process this ourselves. But here's what I would ask for you to do. As things come up that you are reverting back to stories and things that have happened to you, write it down. Write just the facts. This thing that happened to you, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. Write it down like the bare bones of a script, the initial thoughts of a screenplay. Go back in there. Don't change the facts, but change what it is that you're telling yourself about that story. This thing happened to me that I can't do anything about, but I can do something about how I'm constantly referring back to the story to tell me who I am and how I should feel. The freedom is that you have the ability to change what these things mean about you. And if you find yourself in this spiral of telling yourself how you're never good enough, how you can't change, chances are there's something that has caught a hold of you that has grown and metastasized into something larger than it should be. Now, secondly, and moving forward, in the future, man, dream big. We've had some other episodes where we talk about being creative. We talk about pretending. We talked about stepping into something that really inspires you, that really creates this generative drive moving forward. But as you put these dreams in place, have a realistic planning session about what you're actually agreeing to. A lot of times we forget to do that. I have these expectations to have, this is not an anecdote, this is a real comment, to have this really successful building, to have this really successful business, to have this online education company that does all of these amazing things. But am I agreeing to compromise my health, to compromise my relationships, to be an absentee father to do that? Well, the answer is no. But a lot of times I don't go to those steps and that extent to really spell out that the expectations I have are unrealistic. You can't have it all. Now, how do you air this out? This, because it doesn't typically have as much trauma or pain associated with it, it's a wonderful thing to say out loud. And you know the best audience for this? It's a 10-year-old. It's a 10-year-old that doesn't have any of these hangups, any of these feelings, any of these expectations, any of the comparison games that you currently struggle with. Tell them what it is that you want to accomplish. Tell them what it is that you're willing to compromise on in order to do it, and see how they respond. And I bet before those words even come out of your mouth, you're going to be able to self-edit what you know is just totally preposterous and unrealistic. In closing, self-loathing isn't for the bums kicking shopping carts out on the curb. Self-loathing is something that all of us can feel at times, and it's not just for the failures out there. There are, by the rest of the world's standards, incredibly successful people who are never satisfied and are never doing enough to finally be good enough in their own eyes. You don't have to be that. You can feel it. You can, as they say, feel the fire, but get out of there as quick as possible. It's a great quote that says, in order to be a phoenix, you got to be burned, but we don't want to be charred to a crisp. You know what I'm saying? This has been a monumental statement about incremental change, brought to you by the good people at BPR.